and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to do a book review of Victorian Villains by Barry Redfern. So if you watched my Reading Through My Family Tree Victorian England quarterly TBR video, you'll know that Victorian Villains was one of the books that I was most excited to read, and I did read it straight away. So I know this is kind of a niche topic for a book review, but I asked on Instagram and there was a few people who were still interested in hearing my thoughts on this book. So I thought since I really enjoyed this book and had a few things to say about it, I would make this video anyway, and hopefully there are a few people who will find the information interesting and possibly consider picking up Victorian Villains. So the full title, Victorian Villains, Prisoners from Newcastle Gaol 1871 to 1873, does really sum up what this book is about very well. So like I mentioned in my previous video, this book is taking a folio of these jail admittance forms and researching into the story of the crimes, the lives of the people who have been photographed, and the various criminal justice policies and punishments that were in practice at the time. The stories of each of these prisoners is sometimes contained in just a few lines and sometimes spans a few pages as the author digs more into the backstory, finding old census records, discussing previous convictions, and finding newspaper clippings from the time period that discussed the case. In that way, it did really remind me of The Five by Haley Rubenhold, which you know I loved last year, because the author did take the time to examine the backstories of some of these individuals and try to pin down the reasonings behind why they ended up being involved in the criminal justice system. Then mixed in throughout the shorter chapters that deal with these individuals and their photographs and stories, there are also a few longer form chapters that deal with things like the challenges that Newcastle was facing at the time in adequately staffing their police force, changes in prison architecture, and policies around youth offenders at the time. The author, Barry Redfern, is a retired former chief superintendent of the Northumbria Police, so he is coming at it from that perspective and insight. The most interesting topic that was touched on in this book that I hadn't really previously thought of was the impact of the end of transportation on prison populations in the UK. So the last prison ship left the UK in 1867 and ended more than 250 years of penal transportation policy in the UK to their various colonies, to North America before the American Revolution, and then to Australia after that. And to Australia alone, over 160,000 prisoners were transported. So obviously when that policy came to an end at the end of the 1860s, as we moved into the early 1870s, which is the time period covered in this book, there was a significant increase in prison populations throughout communities of the UK that had previously been sending different felons overseas rather than attempting to detain and rehabilitate them within their own communities. So this book discusses how that policy change saw this dramatic influx in inmate populations in local jails throughout the UK, and how the institutions at the time hadn't really been built to accommodate that kind of prisoner population, and the impact that that had on living conditions and sentencing. Well, obviously I knew about the transportation policy and that it had come to an end. I had never really thought through the ramifications of that and the impact that would have been felt in small communities and towns and cities throughout the UK, that this would have been a fairly significant change to past practice that would have definitely had an impact that would have been felt by ordinary people in these communities. At the same time, this book also presents this time period as one of evolving perspectives towards youth offenders, and there's actually a whole chapter that deals with some of the stories of the youngest people photographed. So we have this little girl, Ellen, who was only 11 when she was jailed. We have some of these other children, 13, 14 years old. And from what I could gather from this book, it seems like this was a time period when public policymakers and thinkers were really grappling with reformatories versus jails for young offenders. This book explains how at the time the laws required that young offenders serve jail time prior to entering into a reformatory. And from what this book says, that policy was quite contested at the time, and it shares some newspaper clippings and studies from the time period that was discussing the impact of this policy, particularly on young girls who were forced to spend time in jail before entering a reformatory school, and they were finding that even if these girls were only in the jail system for a week, 10 days before entering the reformatory schools, they were still making acquaintances and connections with more hardened older criminals that were leading them into a life of recidivism rather than rehabilitation. So there was a movement at the time to try to move away from that, to allow young offenders to go straight from sentencing into reformatory schools so that they wouldn't be exposed to the broader criminal networks in their cities, and that they could be sent straight to somewhere that was focused exclusively on young offenders and in an environment with people their own age. Obviously, in this time period, life was quite difficult for the working class, and especially difficult for those who were imprisoned. This is a picture of the architectural plans for the Newcastle Jail, and then on the back cover we can see what it looked like when it was actually built. Quite an intimidating fortress of an institution. And the chapters that discuss life behind these walls really highlighted the incredible difficulties that inmates at the time period had to deal with. While often being sentenced to hard labor, working on monotonous tasks for hours and hours and hours, each day the diet primarily consisted, it seems like, of bread and oatmeal porridge, which is not a very balanced or appetizing diet. And apparently people in this time period also did not find that diet very appealing, because the author discusses some issues with prison security and how one of the primary objectives for inmates looking to get contraband inside the prison was getting additional food items. So he describes how prisoners at the time would use old matchboxes and enclose inside the matchbox a note and a few coins, throw it over the wall attached to a piece of string, and young children would then go read the note, take the coins, and usually buy like a sausage or a piece of fruit, tie it to the string, and then they would pull the string back over the wall and have a little extra treat to eat that evening. This was obviously somewhat risky, so there were some stories, like this story of someone who was arrested for throwing tobacco over the walls of the jail, and there's a fascinating excerpt that I'll read. It was from the 24th annual report of the Inspectors of Prisons for the Northern District, 1859. So this is a report by government officials in the time period discussing their inspection of Newcastle Jail. In one of my visits to the jail during the past year, I had an opportunity of witnessing the manner in which forbidden things are passed into the prison. Accompanied by the head warden, I was examining a piece of ground between the boundary wall and the end of one of the prison wings, when all at once, on some understood signal, a regular heavy shower of missiles commenced flying over my head, some from the prison yard, but the greater from beyond the boundary wall. Most of these from the outside reached their destination, but a great many others missed their mark, and striking against the wall of the prison wing, fell near where we were standing. I picked up one parcel containing about a pound of tobacco, and it was written on the cover that a similar quantity would be thrown over on the Saturday following. The missiles thrown from the prison were chiefly pieces of bread, which probably conveyed some communication. The shower lasted about 5 minutes. So I found that absolutely fascinating to think about them taking their stale and moldy pieces of bread, writing a note on it, and throwing it across the wall, hoping that someone would find it and throw something better across. And it seems like Newcastle did have a chronic issue with both police staffing levels and prison security, and they were constantly being called out in annual reports. There's also an interesting chapter called Persons Afflicted that was discussing visible signs of disability in the photographs, whether that be smallpox scarring or missing or damaged limbs. What I found particularly interesting about the number of people that were impacted by smallpox scarring is how unequal the gender distribution was. So it says 21 of 67 females across the range 11 years to 60 were recorded as being marked by smallpox and having scarred faces on their intake forms, whereas only 31 of 167 males in an age range of 12 to 64 years was similarly labeled. So that means about 30% of the female prisoners at the time period were impacted by smallpox scarring, whereas only 18% of the male prison population was. And that really made me wonder, why is that? Smallpox isn't a disease that women are more affected by, which made me wonder one of two things. Did more women get smallpox in the time period because they were the people who had been caring for sick individuals in the family, so they were more likely to have had the disease spread to them, and therefore were more women actually getting smallpox at the time period, even though there was no biological reason why women would have been more affected? Or were women who were scarred by smallpox more likely to be in a vulnerable situation, economically unstable, perhaps unmarried, whereas men who had smallpox scarring perhaps did not face the same social ramifications of not adhering to beauty standards at the time, and were more likely to be able to find regular employment and have a normal family life. So I don't know the answer to that question. It was just something that caught my eye, that there was such a discrepancy in the percentage of men and women impacted by smallpox that were also in the Newcastle jail at the time. And ultimately, it is the pictures that make this book so special. The collection of pictures is so unique, and it's fascinating to have the photo right there while reading the details from the newspaper excerpts and court proceedings about the crime, because it really does humanize the situation to see the faces of the individuals being discussed. Being able to see the different clothing styles, facial expressions, etc. really brought the stories to life in a way that just reading the text could not have done. And the author did make a point throughout of discussing what their clothing items or grooming habits might have said about their social class at the time. So it is just a real treasure to have all these photographs showing a segment of society in the Victorian era that might otherwise not have photos that have been preserved up to today. As for my own personal genealogical link to this book, as I mentioned in my TBR video for my Victorian family tree, I did have a whole branch of my family that was from the Newcastle, Durham area. So I found this book to be an absolutely incredible glimpse into what life was like in my ancestors' community at a specific time period. I know my ancestors did also have some brushes with the legal system. I found newspaper clippings that my third time's great-grandmother's brother had pigeons stolen out of the family's backyard, and the missing birds were eventually tracked down to Granger Street, which was mentioned a number of times throughout this book as kind of a street with a notorious reputation. So it really set the scene for me now of imagining my three times great-granduncle searching the streets for his missing pigeons and ending up on this kind of seedy street and seeing his birds in the window of this merchant shop. And the culprit in this crime was eventually tracked down and sentenced to 7 days imprisonment in the Newcastle jail. I actually found a number of stories in the book about pigeons being stolen, which I found really interesting because I thought that this was kind of a unique story in my family tree, and apparently pigeon theft was something to be concerned about in the Victorian era. And most tragically, and I won't go into all of the details because it is actually quite a dark and disturbing story to investigate, my two times great-grandmother's aunt was arrested in Newcastle in 1876 when it was discovered that her two children were not, in fact, on a prolonged visit to family in another community, but had instead died of starvation and neglect. That whole branch of my family tree had a lot of challenges in the Victorian time period. There was a lot of broken family units, significant poverty, and it seems like this woman had been left by her husband, which is how I connect into the story. Her husband was my three times great-grandfather's brother, and her husband had apparently been in and out of jail for drunkenness over the course of their marriage and had eventually abandoned the family, and she must have been struggling to make ends meet because witness accounts say that she was often gone for 12, 13, 14 hours a day trying to find work as a cleaner. And it must have been quite a sensational case at the time because the newspapers typed up complete verbatim witness statements from her father, neighbors, people who had been involved in her and these children's lives, as well as the complete coroner report from the scene. And all of this took place at the Newcastle Police Court, and she was imprisoned in the Newcastle jail. So all of these events took place in 1876, which is just 3 years after the time period that this book really focuses on. So I know that it would not have changed really at all from what was described in this book. So she was held in this jail right here from the time of her arrest Until sentencing, she was convicted of manslaughter, and she did tragically die herself, apparently of natural causes, behind these walls just a couple of weeks after the verdict of manslaughter was reached. So ever since I first read these heartbreaking newspaper articles and learned about the whole tragic situation and the events surrounding it, I have felt a bit of an obligation to remember these two children, Robert and Annie, who were about 8 and 4 when they passed away, because they obviously don't have any direct descendants to keep their memory alive. So reading this book and learning more about the criminal justice system at the time and what life was like inside Newcastle Jail and during police court proceedings has really helped to fill out my perspective on what the trial and prison portion of their mother's story must have been like. So I definitely had a personal interest in this book, in addition to just finding it interesting Victorian social history. Anyway, to wrap things up, I would recommend this book to fans of Oliver Twist, anyone with an interest in Victorian penal policy and practice, lovers of The Five by Hayley Rubenhold, and people with roots in the Newcastle area. So if any of those apply to you, or you think you might be interested in Victorian villains, it is a very short read, and it is a fascinating insight into what life was like for people who were facing imprisonment in the Victorian era. So that's my review of Victorian Villains by Barry Redfern. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.